Hi everybody, I'm Erik Ringstad. Today we're here to talk about blues chording for the beginning blues guitarist. Blues is a great style of music. It's a very guitar-friendly style of music. One of the really cool things about it is you don't have to be an expert to get going in the style. So with that in mind, the first thing we're going to discuss is the most common chord progression for a 12-bar blues, and that would be the 1-4-5 chord progression. So how do you figure out a 1-4-5 chord progression? It's pretty simple, really. You would take the first, fourth, and fifth notes of any given major scale, depending on the key you want to be in, and build chords on those notes. So for instance, if we're in the key of A, build a major scale out of the notes A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, back to A again. First note of that scale was an A. The fourth note of that scale was a D. And the fifth note of the scale was an E. And as you can see, I'm just playing regular old open position chords, regular major chords, which would bring me to the discussion of the most common type of chord that you would use, or the most common chord quality that you would use when playing blues, and that would be the dominant seventh chord. The dominant seventh chord differs from a major chord in the inclusion of the flat seventh scale degree. So in an A chord, if I add a G to that regular old A chord, I get that, which as you can hear is far bluesier sounding. Here's a D major, and here's a D7, where I'm adding the C note to the D chord, which is the flat seventh scale degree of the D. In an E, here's an E major chord, and here's an E seventh chord, where I'm adding a D note to the basic E major sound. We're already sounding much more bluesy by doing that. So we have our three chords. The next thing we need to do is figure out an idea to carry through the 12-bar chord progression, which brings us to another defining characteristic of blues music. Very often, it's built on a 1 or 2 measure repetitive pattern that carries through the chord changes. For today's examples, we'll deal with 1 measure phrases. Now, I could certainly play quarter notes or eighth notes in a steady pattern, but it might be a little more interesting to perhaps use a little syncopation and vary that rhythm a little bit to create a more ear-pleasing sound. So what if I were to play on 1 and the end of 2 of a measure? I might get this. Okay, so I played a chord on 1 and the end of 2, and then you also heard I put a little muted strum on 2 and 4. So the combination of that muted strum and the syncopated chord played on the end of beat 2 really gives you a part that has a lot of forward momentum to it. So I'm going to play through that 12 bar, and I'm going to shout out the chords as I go. Remembering we're using a 1 chord, the A7, our 4 chord, the D7, and our 5 chord, the E7. Here's how a typical blues might go, starting with the A7. A 1, 2, 3, 4. D7. Back to A7. Here's the D7 again. Back to the A7. Now we're going to go down to the E. The D. And back to the A again. Now we're back to the top again. Just keeps flipping around with that 12-bar structure. So a couple of things to note on that example I just played is the last 2 measures, I switched the chords twice as fast. The last 2 measures of a blues are typically called the turnaround, and that's where the most variation happens. So that's why I switched those chords twice as fast, just to create a little something that perks up the progression, brings it back around to the top again. So that pattern just doesn't hammer you over and over with the same thing for 12 bars. That little bit of variation really kind of perks up your ear. Another thing I did was I threw in a D chord on the second measure of the progression, which does not have to happen, but again, because I threw in that different chord, it just creates a little more harmonic interest, a little more harmonic motion. But really, there's no rule that says you have to do any of this stuff that I'm saying, which is one of the beautiful things about blues music. So let's move to another key now. Let's say we're in the key of E. My 1 chord would be an E7, my 4 chord would be an A7, and my 5 chord would be a B7. And again, we're dealing with typical open position dominant 7th chords, ones you might find at the beginning of any typical guitar instruction book. E7, A7, and B7. So for this example, let's go a little farther with our 1-bar phrase and maybe break up the bass note from the rest of the chord to create a phrase that sounds a little more full. So my one measure phrase was this. 1, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. Again, we're just using very typical open position chords. So now would be a good time to talk about the shuffle rhythm, the most often used rhythm when you play blues music. So we all probably know what eighth notes are. An eighth note is a note that lasts for half of a count. An eighth note generally sounds like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, where there's 2 equal subdivisions of a beat. In a shuffle field, there are 3 equal subdivisions of a beat, which really makes it a triplet type of a feel, but you usually play on the first and the third of each triplet. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and which produces that really common blues sound. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and Now, another thing that really helps along that blues sound is, I'm going to turn to the side a little bit so you can see it, is if you put silence in between the first and third of each triplet. So what I'm doing is I'm coming down like that with the heel of my palm to create silence between the first and third of each triplet. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and now if I don't do that, I get this, which sounds just fine. But if I do it, you get a tighter feel out of it, and you get a more typical blues sound. Now let's talk about the chord I'm playing right there. So, if I have an open A chord, the bottom 2 notes of that chord are an A and an E. I'm playing the open 5th string and the 2nd fret of the 4th string only. That's a power chord. That's an A power chord. Many of you probably know power chords already. I'm putting a little palm muting on that. And I'm also going to add the 6th scale degree alternating with the 5th scale degree, like so. So that's going from the 2nd fret to the 4th fret on the 4th string while I keep the 5th string open underneath it. The 5th string is your A bass note, your A root note. So I'm playing an A power chord basically to an incomplete A6th type of sound. You put that all together, you get a very typical blues sound. The power chord with the added 6th degree, with the shuffle rhythm. Here's the D, back to the A, go down to the 5, the E, to the D, back to the A. And as you can hear, I put a little variation in at the turnaround there. Again, just keeps things interesting when you flip it around to the top again. So that is a very, very typical, important sound you want to know inside and out and be able to play in any key. As you can see, I was basing that on open string root notes, but it's perfectly possible to play these things fretted, which allows you to play them in any key. And so on and so forth. So for our final example today, we're going to do something a little more sophisticated, a little more advanced. Do something that I call the 6-9 rhythm. Okay, so what that is, it's just 2 minor triads being played over a bass note. If I have an A bass note, open 5th string, and I play F sharp minor to E minor on top of that, those are minor triads built on the 6th and 5th notes of the scale, and then I slide into each one of those chords, you get a really expressive, more sophisticated, more of an uptown vibe out of the chord progression. Now when you go to the D, the 4 chord, you have your open 4th string, and you get this 1 fret barred shape. And again, slide up and then slide down to really heighten the bluesy effect of those chords. Because blues blues is all about expression, so you want to be playing expressively when you do this stuff. So I hope you've enjoyed this little overview of blues guitar rhythm. There's certainly more to come because it's a huge world of interesting chord voicings to play and interesting rhythm patterns. Wish you all the best of luck in your blues guitar playing, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.